Bat flying in the sky, I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, it's Minecraft story time. Hey there guys, this is Chauncey J. Kent, and welcome to another episode of Minecraft story time. Oh, and you should be looking at me. Yes, I've decided to wear my armor tonight because, honestly, this story freaks me out a little bit, and I just feel a little safer this way. So, if you're ready, we'll dive right into it. The air was cool, much more so than Steve preferred, especially when he was caught out in the rain, as was the case on this night. His altitude didn't help things much, being as he was up above the frost line where snow wouldn't melt naturally. Steve knew he could survive the rain, and even the cold. Such things never really bothered him, but the monsters were a problem. Zombies, dozens of them, followed him up onto the mountain. Steve had raced up here, hoping many would fall to their deaths as they tried to follow him up, and some had. But with every dead zombie, 3 more seemed to replace it. Steve's armor had broken long before, as the night had first begun to fall, and his sword had shattered even before that, leaving Steve unprotected and unarmed. "Arr!" Steve shouted involuntarily as a zombie he hadn't seen got his arm and took a small chunk of his exposed flesh. Steve punched him with his other arm, knocking the zombie back and sending him tumbling away down the mountain. "I can barely see in this rain," he said to himself. "I need to get some cover so I can see these guys coming." Zombies typically weren't a big deal for Steve. He dispatched many in his day, but with the rain came reduced visibility and a constant distraction of movement on all sides that created a sort of white noise that gave stealth to the foul and dead currently chasing him. Yet there was hope. It was only a brief moment, little more than a misty glimpse, but Steve thought he saw a forest off in the distance, maybe 100 meters from the foot of the mountain. Sure, it was a lot of open ground to cover in the dead of night, but Steve was confident that he could manage it and come out unscathed. Steve began to move down the mountainside more quickly, hazarding longer falls and moving ever in the direction of what he'd come to believe was his salvation. The ground began to level and flatten, going down more slowly and spreading into an open plain. Unfortunately, the plain was easily 3 times larger than Steve had originally thought, but what did that matter now? He had a plan, and he had little choice but to try and attempt it. The rain intensified, and it seemed to get just a little darker, if that were even possible. Then the worst turn of luck so far that evening occurred, which was saying a lot considering what events had led to this moment. A lightning strike off in the distance. It was a thunderstorm. The chances were low that he'd get hit, but it could happen, and that would end his adventure rather quickly. Not to mention, he was now in the middle of an open field and soaking wet. Steve took off running in the direction of the woods, sprinting as fast as his legs would carry him despite the ever-worsening visibility. Suddenly, Steve found himself face to face with a thick tree trunk. He tried to stop but ran face first into it. The tree caused no permanent damage, but caused considerable injury to his pride. "If I live to write about this, I'll just leave that out," he said to himself. Steve had crossed the distance much faster than he'd anticipated, and with far less resistance. Finally, a break, he said to himself, as he evaluated his new situation. The zombies were still out there and coming this way, meaning the best course for his safety was likely deeper into the woods. Very little of the rain was making it to the ground, as most was being blocked by the thick leafy canopy held aloft by the many dark-trunked trees that made up the forest. Steve had never before seen trees like these, but they appeared to him to be a darker version of the oak trees he was already familiar with. So far as Steve could tell, the way ahead seemed clear, and he knew the path behind him led to death. Thus, Steve began to walk deeper into the forest, picking his way around trees and avoiding those few gaps the rain could find to breach the canopy. Steve felt as though he'd been walking for ages. He needed to get his bearings, figure out which way was home, as the whole of the wood now surrounded him, and went on as far as he could see. He pulled out his map and began plotting a route back towards home. Steve knew that sound all too well. Without even thinking, he sprinted away, switching to where his sword should be as he did so, realizing too late that his sword broke some time ago. Boom! As expected, there was an explosion behind him, throwing him further forward and making his ears ring loudly. Steve didn't so much feel the impact with the tree in front of him, as he did the effect of it. In a moment, the majority of his left side was lit up with pain like a Christmas tree is lit with lights. Several ribs were cracked, making breathing more difficult, and his left arm no longer seemed to move without intense levels of pain. Minor cuts and scrapes covered the whole of his side and began to bleed and swell, and Steve was certain he'd rather seriously injured his knee as well. However, he was alive, and even with the pain, he felt he could keep going, especially now that he had an idea where home was. Steve limped further on his path, taking him deeper into the woods. He knew it was a risky move. If there was one creeper here, there were bound to be more, but Steve felt he had little choice. Injured as he was, he needed to find home as soon as possible, so natural healing could do its work, and so he pressed on. Steve couldn't relax, though. Maybe it was the blow to his head, or maybe it was just nerves, but Steve was seeing creepers around every corner, and behind every tree. They can't all be real, he said to himself, hopefully. Even so, he found himself running from the slightest noise, and jumping every time he thought he saw bright green. Finally, he could take no more. "All right, Steve, that's enough. Get a grip, man. All of these creepers can't be—" Boom! Steve was thrown to the side with a force that felt like being hit in the face with a shovel, tossing his body unceremoniously into a small, barely exposed underground lake. The water cushioned his fall, and though it ruined his attempt to dry off from the rain, Steve was thankful for the soft landing. He swam as best he could to the surface of the water, and checking himself over, quickly realized with horror that he had come a hair's breadth from being killed. Had he not landed in the water, he certainly would have come to a different end. Steve crawled out of the pool and tucked himself back into a small corner. He pulled out a piece of now very moist bread and ate a bit to recover his strength. It took a few moments, but he began to feel like he could carry on, and he looked for an easy way out of this hole. The simplest way seemed to be to dig out a couple blocks to make a small staircase to climb out of, and so Steve did just that. He poked his head up, and seeing no creepers or other mobs, crawled the rest of the way out and started back along his course home. Something wasn't right, though. It had been long enough for the sun to have risen, but the storm raged on, and the canopy blocked so much light that it was like constant night beneath its boughs. He had to get back out of here and back to his home. Steve ate a little more as he walked and eventually found the strength to run in short bursts, stopping only to find his way around a tree. But finally, something forced him to stop and wonder if these woods were really a natural thing, or if they had been created by someone. A large clearing stood before him, with a raised stone outcropping at its center. The clearing was covered in a swarm of creepers, more than Steve thought was even possible. As he stood in mixed awe and horror at the sight before him, Steve saw another creeper rise up from the center of the stone protrusion and walk down it, amongst its many simplings. "What is this?" Steve asked himself, moving closer to get a better look, and as he approached, many of the creepers noticed his presence and moved towards him. Thankfully, there was a fence in the way. Better not get too close, Steve thought to himself. Suddenly, as he examined the creeper pen, a bolt of lightning cracked down from the raging sky, striking the fence on its way groundward. The fence splintered and broke into a million tiny pieces as it gave way under the lightning, and creepers began to pour out of the pen and rush towards Steve. But these were different somehow. The ones nearest to the fence had been altered by the strike in some way and now glowed with an ominous blue aura. Steve wasted no time and bolted away. As he struggled and searched for something in his pack, the creepers seemed able to keep pace and chased him ever further through the woods. He looked back quickly. "There must be dozens," he said to himself as he finally found what he'd been groping for in his pack. He pulled out a small bit of flint with a small steel striker for lighting fires. He tossed his pack back on and turned to face the oncoming swarm. Steve pointed his flint and steel at the ground to light it, ablaze as a trap for the creepers, but one of the glowing ones moved too quickly and got in the way. Steve looked up suddenly with horror on his face and just stared at the creeper for a second that seemed to stretch into hours. The creeper suddenly stopped, even as its cohorts moved around it to kill Steve. There was a confused look on the creeper's face as it began to hiss and expand. "It's gonna blow," Steve realized, and jumped back with all he was worth. The creeper exploded with more force than Steve had ever heard of before, breaking blocks with ease and bones just as handily. The creepers that had followed the glowing one were killed instantly, leaving nothing but a massive crater, and a number of items scattered around on the ground. Steve woke with a start. He was in his base, standing next to his bed. He felt healthy, well fed, and well rested, but still found himself unsettled. With his awakening, he found that it was late morning, and the rain had ceased. Steve grabbed a little food, some armor, and a new sword, and ran out to the woods where he'd died. He had actually not been far from making it home. It was crazy to think that these woods had been so close all this time, and he'd never known about them. It wasn't hard to find the spot where the creeper had exploded. The crater was so large you could fit several horses in there comfortably, and many, many more if you crammed them in. Steve gathered his stuff, noting a couple lost items, but nothing of serious consequence, and found a small stack of curious items he'd never seen before. He picked them up and found them to be creeper heads? There were at least 7 scattered around in the crater, grim reminders of the previous evening's events. Steve knew he'd have made it if it hadn't been for that stupid pen, and he was going to make sure it was never a problem again. He hadn't come far from where he had died, and he knew right where to look. He stormed up to the spot with righteous anger bubbling up within him, until he realized with some confusion that the pen and the stone protrusion were gone, as were all the creepers. What? Steve said to himself. Where could it have gone? Steve looked frantically for it. The large clearing was there, but everything else was gone. Even digging down revealed nothing. How could it just disappear? Steve wondered out loud. Even as he did this, a creeping feeling began to claw its way into the back of his mind. Was it possible he'd actually imagined the pen, and that his death had been just an unfortunate run of bad luck? Or was it possible that someone else was out there, hiding and biding their time until they could find a way to end Steve permanently? This final thought led Steve to but one question. Who? The end? Alright guys, well that was the story Jeepers Creepers, and I probably should have told you the title up front. But if you enjoyed it and you want more stories like this one, be sure to leave a like on the video, and of course if you are not subscribed, be sure to do so you know when those stories actually come out. So, thanks for watching guys, I do appreciate it, and as always, I will talk at you later.